Well, we are officially coming towards the end of Star Wars Andor. This was the penultimate episode, and it was wonderful as usual. The writing was top-notch, the performances were exceptional, it looked great, and just as I say every single week, because I'm a broken record player when it comes to this show, it's just another strong episode of world building and specifically character moments and character development in itself. Now, there are some spoilers ahead, so you have been warned. So the episode starts out slowly with Cassian hanging off of the edge of a cliff, hiding from the Empire. I don't really see the point of this bit, but we instantly jump into what was the meat of the episode after a few seconds, and that is the death of Cassian's mother, supposedly though. Now, I do understand why they have done this. It's necessary to bring certain characters together to further the plot, and they need a focal point to do that, but I feel like more could have been done with Marva maybe before we got to her death, but as I say that, we've had a lot of character development across this show, and maybe she was just one that couldn't really be squeezed into that. But surprisingly, the initial stages of her death focus on the droid BMO. Now, I love this droid. I've said it since the beginning of the show. He's a wonderful addition to the show itself, and they really try to humanize him. Or at the very least, they are trying to make him come across as like a loyal pet or something. He really wants to stay in this home. He wants to be where Marva was. He wants to help. And it is hard to humanize a machine, and they do a really good job of making it quite touching and quite emotional every time BMO's on screen. And everything he says genuinely comes across as quite sad and emotional that he's lost his owner. And they do this brilliantly, not necessarily with the dialogue, but the way the droid actually moves. His movement gives off emotion, the way his head recoils back into his body when he's sad or shy, the way he hides his eyes, it just really gives him character. So hats off to them for being able to do that. We then jump back to Cassian, and he and Melshi notice a rugged ship in the middle of a quarry, and they go sprinting towards it, and the locals have a trap, and they snatch them up in these nets that look like organic matter, and it leaves all of this interesting looking stuff over them. And I genuinely love these guys, the way they talk, the way they look, their visual designs. I just thought it was a real welcome addition to the Star Wars universe. There's been a real lack of aliens and whatnot in the show, probably one of the biggest criticisms to actually give it, but these two dudes were exceptionally creative, and I loved every second they were on screen. They initially come off as bad dudes, but they are just fishermen who don't like the Empire, and they end up helping Cassian and Melshi off of the planet. Then we get a little bit of character focus on Vel, because she goes to Luthen's shop, and she kind of comes to blows with Luthen's assistant. Now, Luthen and his assistant do things very much by the books. They try to keep their masks on at all times. They don't want their covers blown whatsoever, whereas Vel doesn't really care. She's not trying to hide who she is. So there's this tense moment between the two characters, and the assistant has some really nice dialogue here. I can't remember her name, sadly, but it was a really good scene, and you can see through this moment that there are so many of these characters whose guises are coming off. Their real selves are slowly being revealed over the course of the show, and many of them are having to come to terms with that fact that they can't keep hiding anymore. There's also a little interlude between this where the ISB are ensuring that the Imperials on Ferrix don't interfere with Marva's funeral because they want to use it as bait, and there's some nice world building here. They're showing the culture of the people on Ferrix. They have their ashes mixed up with cement and turned into bricks and put into buildings. I like little details like this. It's just making the planet feel a little bit more standout and alive and gives the culture of these people some nuance, and I like that. We also have a few scenes of Cinta working in a bar on Ferrix, and there's also an Imperial spy in that bar. Now, I don't know if this is intentional, putting these two characters within the same space. They might do something with that, I don't know. And then we go back to Ferrix, we go back to BMO, and we have another pretty sad scene where he doesn't want to leave the house. This is his home, and the construction worker dude from the first few episodes is kind of dealing with her death. He agrees to stay with BMO so he can kind of mourn, kind of grieve in his own way in his home. And like I said, they're really trying to humanize BMO in some way and trying to give him this emotional kind of pet vibe, and for me it's working because they were some of my favourite scenes in this episode. And then we have a small scene again with Bix, just, showcasing what she's going through. She is pretty screwed up. She looks like she's been through hell, and they're still probing her to try and find information about Luthen, but it seems like she's staying strong. And then we jump over to Mon Mothma, and it seems like the tough decision that she was posed with last week is really taking a toll on her. Despite the fact that she wanted her daughter to kind of branch away from Chandrilan traditions, she kind of already found them herself and chosen to become accustomed to them, so this means that Mon Mothma can technically use her daughter without forcing her into the traditions that she otherwise wouldn't want her to be a part of. But you can see that she is really struggling to come to terms with the fact that she is going to have to use her daughter to protect herself, basically, and this really weighs on her throughout this episode. And to an extent, it's really weighing on Vel too. I mean, she is family, and again, there was some great dialogue here, just some really good delivery and a very strong performance from Genevieve O'Reilly again, who just emanates internal conflict through facial acting alone. The story then moves over to Cyril, who I thought was pretty interesting at the beginning of the show, but it feels like his story is just taking a while to click, and for me, he's one of the weaker parts of the show at the moment. He is obsessed with Cassian, and he gets a call saying that Cassian's mother has died, and Cassian's likely to appear at the funeral, so he steals his mother's money and runs off to Ferrix. Now look, I like this character in general. I think the performance of the dude is great, and I think the character arc of Cyril is on a knife edge. It can go anywhere really at this point. But I just feel like we aren't really moving the character forward enough at the moment. He's been in the same place since episode 4, and I would argue that he really is the only character right now in this show when his story gets some spotlight that I feel is a little bit boring or a little bit tedious, and I just feel like they've taken too long to move his character forward or move his story arc forward in any way, so it's just becoming a little bit tiring to watch. And the story then goes over to Luthen, who realizes that he kind of has to protect himself now because Saw Gerrera has decided to help Anto Kreegyr attack the Empire. And knowing that Anto Kreegyr is a sacrificial lamb at this point, he can't risk Saw Gerrera getting killed or captured, because Saw Gerrera, unlike Anto Kreegyr, knows way too much about him. And when these two guys are on screen, it's just a wonder to watch. Their performances are brilliant, their delivery of lines is so powerful, and I love Forrest Whitaker as Saw Gerrera, but after like a tense standoff, Saw kind of comes around and accepts, okay, yeah, sacrifices have to be made. We have to give things up to protect other things, and while initially he wasn't accepting of that, he didn't want his fellow rebels to die, it seems, to protect a spy in the ISB, Luthen convinces him that some things are more important. We then get a bit of action as Luthen leaves the planet. He gets pulled up by an Imperial patrol in his starship who seemingly use him as a test for boarding procedures, and he realizes this is way too risky, I can't get caught. So he lets out these like explosives out of the back of the ship, and it blows the hell out of this tractor beam, and then a bunch of TIE fighters scramble, and there's this little space battle, and I thought visually it looked great. It was pretty intense because I honestly didn't know whether they were going to catch him or maybe destroy the ship, because it is kind of the end of the show, so I didn't know if they were going to do something quite surprising, but we have this moment where Luthen's ship's wings like open up and these lasers come out, and he spins around and does a laser spiral to destroy the TIE fighters. And you know, something like this on paper sounds really silly, but to my surprise, it actually looked pretty fine in the show. I think they did that quite well to make it seem more grounded than stupid. And the Imperials just kind of sit there in shock, really. They don't really know what to do, and the leader is standing on the bridge just shaking his head to, I don't know, utter disapproval of his subordinates, and I just thought it was a great little touch. Cassian then returns to the beach planet, grabs his hidden credits and his comlinks back to his home. He gets a call saying, "Hey Cassian, your mum's dead," and this hits Cassian pretty damn hard. His trauma from the prison, from Aldani, I think this, after 11 episodes, is ultimately going to be the breaking point in which he truly becomes a rebel, that the Empire are using his mother to get to him even in death. And I think this is where things are going to click in the old head of Cassian, and then the episode ends. And you know, this wasn't the biggest episode with the craziest moments, or it wasn't necessarily the most well-written episode either, especially compared to some of the exceptional episodes we've had prior. But it was good. It moved Cassian's character arc forward, potentially to where it needs to be, as did it move many of the other character arcs forward. But with that said, I do have one criticism of this show so far, really, and some of you may be surprised at this, but it is Cassian Andor himself. He is probably the weakest part about it. Now, I do enjoy Cassian as a character. I think his character arc has been good, it's been consistent, and I'm not saying it's bad, it's quite the opposite. I do like him. But comparatively, many of the other characters have really stolen the spotlight in this show. For example, Luthen, Mon Mothma, Deidre, Kino, all of these characters have had better moments, they've had better dialogue, they've been performed genuinely better because they've just had more to do on an emotive level, and it feels like Cassian's character arc and his story in general have been used sort of like a foil to accentuate how good all of the other characters are. And I know full well that when I look back on this show and think to myself how much I enjoyed it, I'm not going to look back at the character of Cassian Andor himself, especially this season. And I mean, sure, the plot might have been centered around him, but all of the revolving pieces around that plot are what has made this show stand out to me. But either way, I'm really looking forward to seeing how they manage to close this season out. A part of me feels like a lot of the character arcs are going to be cliffhangers in some way or another. There's going to be a lot of unresolved situations that they will end up moving into Season 2. But then again, it's a blessing to know that we do have a Season 2 coming and it's not being rushed, unlike other Star Wars shows. As always, if you enjoyed the review, don't forget to hit the like button because it helps me out a great deal. And if you haven't, perhaps consider subscribing so you can watch my review of Andor next week and be notified when that video goes live. I'll see you guys in the next video. But until then, may the Force be with you. Always.